Well, welcome back to the One Big Thing podcast. I'm Steve Campbell, your host. It's an honor to start this one today. I have General Stanley McChrystal on with me, and I'm going to allow him to introduce himself here at the beginning. If you look him up, there's plenty of information about how decorated he is. I first learned about him years ago when we read a book that he wrote called Team of Teams. We developed it in our business and talked about it together. But I thought, who could I have on this show that could really, truly inspire 30 and 40-year-olds that are trying to navigate somewhat difficult seasons of life, whether they're parents or in marriage or just leading in business. And so I wanted to have General McChrystal on today. But for those that don't know you, do you want to take a minute or two here at the beginning just to introduce yourself?
Sure, Steve, I do. And up front, when you say General McChrystal, I look over my shoulder thinking my father's coming. So please call me Stan. And I really look forward to being on this because as we talked, a very practical way about thinking about life is important because life is practical, or at least it should be practical. You know, I have a pretty normal upbringing. I was born in an Army hospital, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. My father was an Army officer. His father was a soldier as well. I had 4 brothers and a sister. I was number 4 of 6. All of my brothers went to the Army for some period. My sister married a soldier. And at age 17, I went off to West Point. So I then began a career in the military. When I got married, a few years after I had entered West Point, really a year after I had graduated, I married the daughter of a career Army officer, and her 3 brothers were soldiers, and her sister was a widow of a soldier I served with. So it gives you a sense that in my life, kind of like a family business, if everybody's farmers or doctors or something, we were soldiers. And it was, to us, very normal. You know, we were middle class, had what we needed, didn't have more than we needed, didn't know what we didn't have, didn't worry about it. I had great loving parents who were extraordinary examples to me, as I've described this to people sometimes. My mother and father didn't sit down and lecture me or any of us on values or on character. They just lived it. I never once remember seeing either of them do anything that was wrong. And you go, now, wait a minute, how could that be? But the little things in life, taking a parking place in front of somebody that you shouldn't or something, I never saw either. I never saw the two fight. Now, I know they were humans. They were flawed like anybody else. But the reality was, as an example, I had parents that I wanted to be like. I wanted to be a soldier like my father. I wanted to be someone who was interested in literature and ideas like my mother. And I wanted to treat people like they treated people. And I didn't always do it perfectly, but I had that great gift. You know, I didn't have parents that bequeathed me a lot of money or land or anything like that, but they gave me something I think even more valuable. They gave me something to try to be, a guidepost.
Mm-hmm. And I love that introduction. And I just think about the listener out there who maybe is trying to relate to what you just shared, but maybe they didn't have the parents that you described, right? And so I think I'm always empathetic to the listener who, when you hear somebody's story, might, be jealous that they didn't have the model in front of them. And now they're trying to navigate being a parent when there was no blueprint for what that looks like, especially in a modern age of technology and social media and the inundation of news. You're trying to be the best mom, be the best dad that you can be. And some people had that modeled. I had that in my mom and dad, kind of very similar situation. I had a father who in my lifetime has never touched alcohol in front of me. He's never raised his voice at my mother. He disciplined us. He took care of us, but he always honored people. And so I'm the youngest of 3 sons. And it's an honor when I hear people say, gosh, you remind me of your father. And when you're not mature enough to understand those things when you're young, you watch them. But then when you try to model, he's the person that now with 4 children under 10 years old, I call, and it's, Dad, am I doing this right? And you had said, to you, when you hear General McChrystal, you think of your father. And I know a couple weeks back we had celebrated Father's Day. It's a very similar feeling for me. When people wish me happy Father's Day, it almost feels like, yeah, my dad, not me. right? And so you take on these roles and responsibilities as you adult and you grow up. And I want to get right into your one big thing because I think we'll have a lot to unpack. But this show is called The One Big Thing because I wanted to have guests from all walks of life that could come on to share one big idea that might help inspire you to move the ball forward in your life. So Stan, if I had to ask you your one big thing that you want to share with our listening audience today, what's one thing you want to share?
Yeah, the idea is going to be character, but I'm going to fall back on you being a father
Hmm.
and me being a father and now a grandfather. If we think about our lives and we try to focus on what's important, many of us work real hard at our jobs and we try to either amass enough so that the family will be taken care of and comfortable, there'll be security. We also have egos. We want to be successful. We want to achieve certain things. We like to do things that people give us credit for because I think that's human and I don't think that's a bad thing. And we want to be good fathers.
Hmm.
But when we say good fathers, we say, well, exactly what does that mean?
Yeah.
And not all of us can pass on to our children our great deeds or the titles that we had or the wealth that we amass or any other thing. But what we can pass on to them is our example.
Hmm.
And the reality is we will pass on them to them our example, whether we think about it or not. And so as I've done thinking, sometimes people will describe someone who's a criminal or a corrupt politician or somebody we don't like. And then they'll say, but he was a really good father. He had the yin and the yang of this person's personality. One was really good and one was not so good. And my argument is if part of the apple is rotten, I'm sorry, the apple's rotten. And so sometimes we can't be there for our kids' Little League games because we got to do other things. Sometimes we can't be there, even in the critical moments of life. I don't know how many soldiers I served with couldn't be there for the birth of their children. And yet, the example that we leave, whether it's right in front of them or even from afar, can be the most powerful gift we can give, which means that our example has got to reflect the kind of character that we want to have and we want to pass on to our sons and daughters. And we can do that. And the great thing about character is we have agency over it. We own it. Nobody else decides what our character is. We do.
And I think when you are trying to work hard and build for your family and also be a good citizen and be aware of what's going on, when you finally do have time to open the cell phone and see the news or look at your desktop, there's so much information that's thrown at you. And many guests and I have talked about, we have so much access to so much information that generations before never had. And so you're trying to live kind of this dual responsibility of taking care of your family as a mother, as a father, but also being aware of what's going on in the world and where do I fit in all of that and what is character. And I have different political parties telling me what I should think and how I should vote. And I think a lot of people are trying to navigate who they are as a person in the midst of everything that they're experiencing. And you remind me of a prior guest that I had on, and I believe you have a connection with him in JC Glick. You are the third veteran that I've had on the One Big Thing podcast. JC was actually my only repeat guest that I had twice. He was introduced by my old college lacrosse coach, Jim Stagnita, who is a part of Prodromos leadership and introduced me to this gentleman, JC Glick. And when he came on the show, we connected instantaneously. And he talked about quite a bit the dual role of helping people from the military transition back into civilian life. And you have filled the role of a general serving in, high command positions, but also as a father and a grandfather trying to lead and lead well. And I know that you've done plenty of speaking events. So when you speak about character in the book, which I'd love for you to mention the book name and, where people can find it and maybe what the genesis of writing this book is, because you could write about anything. But when you write a book about on character, what was the thought behind this? Why was this an appropriate book to write for this time and season of life that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, Steve, thanks for asking. And JC and I served in the Rangers together.
Hmm.
So there's a bond that's pretty strong. The book, this is the fifth book I've written. And I wrote my memoirs first, and then I wrote Team of Teams, which is a discussion of how organizations can function better in a complex environment. And then I wrote a history book on some leaders, and then I wrote one on risk. And those were all on different subjects, but I wasn't going to write any more books. And then I would sit at night, as my wife and I like to read in our living room, and I would raise issues with her that I had thoughts on. And
Mhm.
she told me to write them down. And they became a series of essays or reflections, as I called them. And what we found as we put them together is they all intersected with the idea of character, some form or fashion. And that's because I'm 70 years old. I'm at that arc of life where I've got a lot of experience behind me and not a lot I got to worry about in front of me, except who I am, who I've been, and who I am going forward. And I'm not worried about my legacy. I'm not worried about what people are going to say about me when I'm gone, except for a small number of people, the people who really know me. We talked before the show began. I have three granddaughters, Emmy, Lou, Elsie, and Daisy, 11, 8, and 5. And they are little blonde haired girls who live next door to me. And so I see them every day. And I am not this venerated grandfather who comes in once a year. I'm like a piece of furniture. They know me, they push me out of the way, they do all of these things, they get me to do things for them. But what I want them to do is I want them as they age and they hear things about me or read things about me or see things about what I did and who I was, that they will map that on top of what they know up front, what they know personally from experience, and that they will come away with the conclusion that I was a good person.
Mhm.
Not that I was a great general or not that I was a successful, whatever it is. But they will say, he was a good person. And that will mean a tremendous amount to me. So when I wrote this book, I really wanted to explore all the aspects of who I am, what was most important to me. And what I found, which was interesting, is that I would start to explore various subjects like faith. And if you had asked me just in passing, what's your opinion on that? I would tell you. But when I tried to write it, I found that I was pressure testing my own thoughts.
Mhm.
And I was having to make a coherent argument to myself about what I thought. And I found often my thinking was much more nuanced than a quick answer could have allowed. And it allowed me to explore some things and uncover some things about me that I just had never taken the time to think about. And so the book is written for me. It's called On Character, Choices That Define a Life, but it doesn't try to tell people what the right choices are. It tells them what I think, and it sort of suggests some questions that they ought to ask themselves and reach their own conclusions. Because I think we're at a time when it's too easy not to think for ourselves, too easy to listen to what social media says or pundit on TV and just accept that. And I think we need to step back and do our own dialectic, our own argument with us, so that we arrive at what I call convictions, the things I believe in strongly.
Yeah, and over the last 3 years that I've been recording this show, the variation of guests has been really incredible for me. That I've had guests that are in their 30s like me, and we're in the thick of navigating things together and sharing best practices as we're kind of going through it. But then I've also been graced with people that have gone ahead of me, and now they're sharing backwards years of wisdom and experience. And I think the challenge is to never want to circumvent the learning human experience. That um, hardship is a part of life, and hardship helps you understand how you're really wired and what's important to you. And I think when you have young children, I would imagine my four kids would call you Grandpa Stan if they were living next door. Um, I think sometimes as a dad or as a mom, you want to protect your children from things that even you truthfully don't understand. And it's easy to, I think today, take so much guidance from what's being thrown at you when you open your Instagram account, or you should be raising your kids this way. And even now, more so today, I mean, raising kids and the nutrition that they have and the products that are in food. We didn't think about that in the 90s growing up. And now it's you're reading every box and food dye colors and what strings to this and leads to this. And it's very easy. I had mentioned this before in an episode, but I read a book years ago about the level of narcissism that was a part of a study that in the early 1900s, they did a study across college campuses of the level of importance that people on campus thought they played in the world around them. And the narcissism score was very low. Not that people didn't love themselves, but they didn't think that they were really part of a larger story. And they ran that very similar survey in the late 1900s, early 2000s on college campuses, and the level of narcissism was through the roof of college students that thought that they were important, which is true, and that they could change the world, which is true. But the thought pattern behind it could be skewed in many ways. And what they realized is that through this study, the level of depression was also just as high as narcissism. And the reason that they discovered is that when you are introduced to more choices, those choices can lead to anxiety because you don't know if you're making the right choice. And the study looked at, you used to be able to walk into a jeans store and you had two choices of blue jeans. You picked one of the two, and you either picked the right one or you went back and tried again. And now, when you have young people that are now, as adults, raising children of their own and navigating business and their entire lives, they've had generational ways that parents have raised them. Where, again, when my grandfather, who was a World War II, both of my grandfathers were World War II veterans, never told my parents that they loved them consistently, right? And so they served well, but they never verbally communicated that they loved them. So my mom and dad consciously decided to tell me and my brothers how much they loved us over and over and over again because they led from what they never received. And so what you've discovered is that you have young people that are now in their 30s and 40s that are trying to navigate big life decisions that have been told from guidance counselors and teachers growing up. You are going to change the world. You are a part of the light. You are going to do incredible things. And you have people now finding that anxiety and depression is so high because they don't know if they're doing what's been spoken over them, because the number of choices is absolutely astounding, even down to how you raise your kids and what you feed them and what job you should have. But I think character is the one thing that doesn't change over time. So I guess what has helped you, in the framing of the question is here, you have these grandchildren, but you've also led and led well. How do you help teach character without shortcutting the fact that people have to experience things in life to discover what they really understand? So how do you teach character, or what are the things that you would lead with to help somebody start to develop what their character is?
Yeah. I think characters like leadership, there's a lot of lists out there, the habits of great leaders or the behaviors of
Mhm.
leaders. And, they're fine. And if we all did a list, they'd be pretty similar. But yet we don't all lead as well as other people. And the difference is we sort of know what good character is. Maybe we haven't thought enough about it, but we often lack the discipline to actually execute to that. Meaning, I know how I should treat people with respect. I know that I should be personally disciplined in how I control my emotions, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
But it's really important that we step back on the question of character and say, the choice is ours to live up to it. And we won't live up to it perfectly. In fact, every day, even at my age, I still have failings every single day where I'm not the character that I know I want to be. Now, what I think is important is I don't accept that lower standard as that's now my normal standard. What I do is I sort of criticize myself, and then I say, I'm going to be better tomorrow. And some days I am and some days I'm not. But I think it gives me a constant forcing function to try to be as good as I can. I think in terms of practical things, as we talked about, I think it's also helpful to be overt, not braggadocious about your character, but to make clear to people that it is my intent to be absolutely honest, always. It is my intent to be a loyal friend or a loyal member of a team or an organization. It is my intent to be respectful. And the reason I say is be overt about it, tell people that. Then there is sort of a shared responsibility to hold you to account. Because if I tell my wife, I am not going to do these things, or I am going to do these things, and then when I don't, she's the person who sees it most often. She can look me in the eye and she can say something or not. She doesn't have to say much. The same with my granddaughters. If if I have told them that it is wrong to be dishonest, and then they're with me and they hear me lie, they'll immediately kind of go, Granddaddy, why did you lie to that person? And of course, they hear everything. That's what we have to remember about children. They hear and see everything, even when they're very, very young. And so forcing functions into your life for yourself and to help with other people to help you, I think it's a practical way to make me better than I think I might otherwise be.
Well, and I think probably because you've actually experienced war, I think we have metaphorically, many of us, the idea that we're going through hard things, and it's not necessarily the same thing. But what I've discovered in my life is when I go through seasons of comfort, it doesn't really lead to character development because things are easy. But if I look back, I think even the hardest things I've ever experienced, whether it was my own decision making that led to a mistake, or many times there's things that are beyond our control that happen to us. And I think we can all be honest when we know this was me. I did something wrong versus a boss treated me the wrong way unfairly, a friend, whatever it may be. But trying to learn from those experiences. And so how can we even encourage the person who finds themselves in a very difficult, challenging situation? Because you've been in wartime situations where the answer isn't always clear, but there are principles that exist for how you can move things forward. And so when you speak to people today in a business setting or in a leadership setting, if they're not where they want to be today, what would be Stan's guidebook to becoming the person that, without being braggadocious, as you said, but being honest with yourself? I know I'm not where I want to be. There's a place I want to go. What are the initial steps that you think somebody can begin to take?
One of the advantages of as you age is you start to be reinforced. There's always a day after.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll have these really difficult decisions, maybe in relationships, maybe in a business decision, maybe something you screwed up and you've got to own up to it. And in the moment, there's a temptation to think that this is the climax of my life and everything is going to begin and end here. And then you learn over time that there's a day after. If it goes really badly and you are responsible for great failure, and maybe it's embarrassing, maybe it's expensive for other people, or in the case of a soldier, maybe I've given an order that gets people killed, and I've done that. There's a day after. And the day after doesn't mean it's all over and that means it's all good, but it means you get a chance to move forward. You not only get a chance to move forward, you have a responsibility to move forward. And so if you've ever had a fight with your spouse, and I'm sure most people have, and at a certain point you just think, this is horrific, this can't work, I've said and done things that are irreparable to the relationship. And then you stop and you say, wait a minute, there is a moment after this. No matter how bad it might be right now, it's likely to be better. And if I think that way and I point myself in that direction, I can start moving forward. If I focus just back on the difficulty of the moment, then it becomes all consuming. And so I think that that becomes maybe the most important advantage of amassing a lot of experiences. Earlier, you mentioned, Steve, that we learn the most from those really difficult times, the very challenging job, or you failed completely. And the thing about it is, it might be pretty simple. You might have made the best decision you could, and it just didn't turn out, because that happens. There's a randomness to life, in which case you learn that lesson. Or you might have not prepared well enough, or you might have done some things with judgment or your own integrity that caused it. And those are all opportunities to go, okay, I'm going to take that on board and attempt not to make that same mistake again. But it's having the moorings of character. It's having the things that you believe are important enough to live to or die for, those convictions.
Yeah.
That's a real gift. There's of course, the story of Admiral James Stockdale, who was a prisoner of war in Vietnam, and he was treated horribly for 7 years in the Hanoi Hilton. And he was given the Medal of Honor after his release for his courage. But he was a little older than most of the other prisoners of war. And he was more grounded in himself, in philosophy, in faith. And it's the way he describes it. He couldn't control his physical surroundings or what they did to him or his body. He had to accept that. But he did have this foundation of philosophical strength that let him believe that this would end. He would make it through this. There would be a day after. And so I think if all of us can seek to create that kind of central core of who we are, then what happens to us externally becomes less. It's upsetting in the moment. Don't let me kid anybody. But it makes it so much easier to navigate through.
Well, and the one thing I think I've really appreciated of the several times I've heard you speak is how discerning and calm you are, because it feels like maybe you're brought onto networks of different political sides to hear what does Stan think about XYZ. And your answers are always so well thought out and grounded, not in the emotional headline of the day and to feed into maybe what a network may want you to say. And it's not even that you're always counterintuitive to what they're asking you, but you're very thoughtful in your approach. And, this episode will air right before July 4th. And not even that this is a political question, but my sense is that I think the hard thing about navigating today in your values and character is where you stand in the midst of the larger narrative that's happening around you, because everything is telling you how to feel and what to think. And, if I think about July 4th and independence, when we look back on history, it's easy as an American to say we were the good guys and the British were the bad guys. We were fighting for the larger story of freedom and rights and equality. And when you turn on the news today, depending on what network, they are echoing, we are fighting for freedom and equality and all these things. The other guys are the bad guys. And so what's interesting is when you step back, we're all human beings at the same time. And so I think it's very easy to look back in retrospect and always demonize, but your answers are always so on point. And I think it's because maybe, I don't even call it soul searching, but you've really gotten in touch with who you are and what you believe. And my fear is that it's never been easier to parrot whatever you hear other people say and create agendas against groups of people that you've never met. And all of a sudden, it's hard to navigate being a parent and a husband and a father, because you've never really taken the time to think about, what do I believe in and what do I stand for? Not because my parents believe it or my siblings believe it or the other side believes it, but what has helped you, because you have seen military action. You have served under different administrations. You have seen what people say on TV as presidential leaders, but then what they say behind closed doors and access that we never had. So what has helped you stay so grounded? Because you definitely have your own perspective, and it's not what everyone else always says. And sometimes it's controversial because there are people that want you to say what aligns with what they believe. And when you don't say that, that's when you see the comments on YouTube or whatever that would say he doesn't know what he's talking about. But I respect it because it's thoughtful. So what has helped you after all
Yeah.
of your experiences in the military, in all of your experiences dealing with business leaders, that you have such a pointed, you're so in tap with who you are? How can somebody else model that type of emotional decision making that you've learned over time?
Yeah. You're overly generous, Steve, but I appreciate the point about whoever you were describing. The the idea first, I think, begins with, remember, it's the old quote that's attributed to Mark Twain. I never got in trouble for things I didn't know. I got in trouble for things I was sure of that just weren't true.
Hmm.
And what we find is the temptation to be right, the temptation to come out with, this is good, this is bad, this side is righteous, this side is evil. I've been in very few situations, and particularly in the wars I've been in, really both sides are, in their minds, the good guys. And they would pass lie detector tests that they think they're the good guys. And in reality, the people that I was fighting against, if I'd had their life journey, I'd have been exactly where they were. And I'd have been fighting on their side, and I'd have done all the things that they did. And so when you step back and say, sometimes there are two legitimate, well, almost always there are multiple legitimate perspectives to something, and very rarely is one much more right than the others. Now, the complicating factor is you can't always be in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
There are times you have to take a side. There's times you've got to say, okay, I know that they aren't really evil and we're not really perfect, but the reality is I'm on this team, and I think my side is more righteous or needs to do. And then you go and do things that feels pretty binary, like war or something like that. But as soon as we stop being able to, as you describe, have that discerning ability to question things, that discerning ability to admit that there are other opinions which may be accurate,
Mm-hmm.
then I think we start to, you know, fall prey into wanting to be part of a group, because the group rewards that. If you are writing on social media what everybody else in the string is writing, people just give you two thumbs up, that's great. If you give a political speech now and you get in front of a group and you go, we're going to bash the bad guys and we're going to do X, you'll typically get applause if that's sort of the tenor of that crowd. If you stand up in front of people and say, this is a very nuanced situation, and it's going to require us to be, people are going to fall asleep and a lot of people will wander around and, as you say you don't know what you're talking about. And so it's difficult to avoid seeking that reinforcement of the moment. And a lot of people, not just politicians now, but influencers, pundits, they have made it an art form. And I don't think it's brand new in history, but I think because of information technology, it's democratized. Almost
Mm-hmm.
anybody can be one now. And you find some people can be extraordinarily effective at it. And which reminds us just how vulnerable sort of we all are to the siren's call of hearing what we like to hear.
And there's, in our time that we have, there's two more ideas that were kind of in my head. That one is from your book on character, about how you've built community where you live. Getting people together was fascinating to me. But the other part is, too, when you are in the military and you are in a decorated position, you don't get to choose who the main leader is or what party is in power. And so that sometimes means that you have to serve, and not that you're necessarily coming out and saying, I'm Stan, I believe this, but this is opposed what I believe. You have to be a good soldier, but also stand for certain things. How do we encourage, because you've done it well, the person that may be in a workplace environment is serving somebody that may be different in how they handle things, much like you did with maybe presidential regimes? How do you still maintain your character when everything isn't flowing in the right direction and you
Yeah.
are met with maybe you're second in charge or in part of a group and seeing how the main person leads, and you would never treat somebody that way. What has helped you effectively over the years
Yeah.
serve in capacities when the person who is leading might be opposed to how you actually feel internally?
Yeah. This requires some real thought and maturity. And, sometimes I've been effective at it and sometimes I wish I'd been better. But I think the first thing you understand is your loyalty is for a soldier, it's to the Constitution, and then it's to obviously the civilian leadership and then the military leadership over you. But unless they're doing something that's illegal or immoral, if it's a lawful order, you've got to do it. And you don't get to pick and choose because you can't have a defense where everybody votes on day one whether they want to do an operation or not. And you've also got to make allowances for the styles of the people above you on several levels. The first is you're not standing in their shoes. If your boss is seeing it a certain way and maybe they're emotional or maybe there are a lot of things, you've got to have a little bit of grace for them because in reality, they're probably undergoing pressures and things you don't feel.
Sure.
And so to be too judgmental, I think, is unfair. The second thing is you won't be effective if they think that you are judging them on everything they do. Certainly everyone watches their bosses and assesses and whatnot. But the reality is, as a leader, you want to believe you have a wellspring of loyalty in the people below you that will give you the benefit of the doubt if you don't get outside the lines. They'll put up with you when you're tired and cranky or, any number of things, as long as you don't go outside things that are just accepted norms. And so as a subordinate, I think you've got to look at that and not say, that guy eats with his left hand, and I disagree with that. It's pretty easy to find fault in bosses. And you can actually use that to curry favor with your subordinates. You can blame things on your bosses that they're really not responsible for because it makes you feel like the good guy and it makes them feel like the bad guy. I call those cheap leadership tricks. But so I think the first thing is navigate that with maturity. Mm-hmm. It's really easy to say the bums above us don't know what they're doing. And, maybe they don't. Maybe they're not perfect. But the reality is they may know a lot of things we don't know. So I think start with that particular angle. And then I would like to circle over to the community issue you talked about, because behind my house, I live in a townhouse, and there's a set of about 20 townhouses in this little subdivision inside Alexandria, Virginia. And we have this extraordinary sense of community. And once a month, everybody comes out at 5:00 in the afternoon on a Friday, and they bring their own drink or something to eat, and they all meet behind my garage. And they stand there. Some people bring lawn chairs and they talk and they get to know each other. And that's one day a month. But every other day of the month, the kids are out there playing in the neighborhood. People are watching other people's kids. You're talking as you go. If you leave a package on your front doorstep, if the delivery people, somebody gets it and takes care of it. Everything has a sense of a safety net of community. Now, it takes a little effort to cause that. Yeah. I entertain a lot in my house, particularly out in my garage, and I invite the neighbors most of the time because I figure if they have been a part of that, I'm inoculated against them ever complaining about it. But what it really does is just creates this sense of, together. In fact, we're very dissimilar people. But the reality is everybody has decided to be a good neighbor. They've made the calculation that says, it's kind of nice being a part of this group. So I'm going to make the contribution of my time, which isn't too much, of how I interact with people, simply because I like the dynamic it produces. And it's really unique, but it's something magic.
Yeah, and I read that in your book, and I think we're all secretly desiring community at a level that maybe has been stripped of us, because it's very easy to navigate friendships by the yard signs that they have or how they vote or the algorithm that feeds the information that we want to see. And so we find like-minded people. But I think for me, I've always tried to humanize the people, whether it's the kids I coach on the ball field. You don't get to choose your neighbors. You live in a neighborhood. So you can either, just say it is what it is, or try to build community by seeing the person. And what I have found, at least for myself, is when I will really truly see the person and try to understand what they've been through in life and the experiences that they've had and what makes them them, you can create friendships that, irregardless of political stances, bind you together. And so I think it's very easy, what I talked about earlier, because there is so many choices today for young people to feel isolated and alone. And then you see what's happening on a larger world stage, and you're trying to navigate, where do I fit in the larger narrative that's going on? That there's an opportunity for us to really press in and say, well, what about the neighborhood that you live? You may not be able to affect what's happening on one coast or another of the United States or the Middle East, or, the larger narrative, and that's okay. You're not supposed to have all the answers, but you can start with your neighbors. You can start with the people around you, and it takes time. But the one thing that you just said that I absolutely loved is there's a calculated measure to understand what being a good neighbor is. And so I wonder how we would all kind of get that sense to almost detox in a way from the fact that it's easy just to keep going down the same path and be desperate for change, but then never feel like life is changing. And so I think that this was a very interesting and much well needed conversation, because these are the own challenges that I face, which is, as the youngest of three sons in a family, younger than everyone, I have certain things and convictions that I hold to. And it would be very easy to follow the paths of certain groups and just be led in one way or another. But I also want to lead my children really well, for irregardless of how I feel about somebody else, I want to see them as a person, and I want to understand what makes them them, because you never know, in my world, how that person could change the world. And so rather than me always focusing on the words that have been spoken over my life of, Steve, you're going to change this and do this, if I can help Stan become a little bit better, then maybe Stan's the one that's going to do it. And so rather than making myself the main guy, how can I help empower somebody else along the way? So Stan, we've gone from General McChrystal back to Stan. We've learned about being a grandfather and a father in your military. Is there anything else that you want to leave a listener with today before we bring this one to a close?
Yeah, just the idea that we own it. The
Mm-hmm.
beauty of character is we get to decide. Nobody can decide for us, and nobody can take it away from us unless we do. So thanks so much for the time, Steve. It's been a real honor.
Yeah. And I appreciate your time. It's an honor for me, and to encourage you that whether your story reflects what Stan led off with, that he had two loving parents that modeled for him, or there was a hand that you never asked to be dealt in life and you never saw what that looked like, you still have a choice. And I think if character matters, then if we will all be honest and self-reflect, we may never be able to change our neighbor, but we can change ourselves. And if we change ourselves, then that can create the modeled persona that we want other people to have. And so don't be afraid that if your life doesn't look the way that you thought it would, you still have time. And if you got breath in your lungs, you got time. And it's easy to say, but you don't know what's happened to me and this and that. I don't. But Stan, like you had said, you've been in some very difficult situations where it's sacrificed a lot, it's cost a lot, but you're still you. And so I just want to encourage you. We will put information in the show notes for Stan, for his website, for his books, if you'd like to get in contact with his team. But thank you for being such a great role model for so many of us here, and obviously your service. And I just appreciate you taking this, 45 minutes with me to come on the show. So I appreciate you being a guest.
Thanks again, Steve.